Well, should we go across to the UK for a second? Because, like, one thing that I think, like, I don't know, as somebody who follows, politics pretty closely, um, there is a understandable kind of position a lot of people have where it's like, well, these things are contingent. They're contingent on like the very specific historical, geographical, areas where they come from. And I think this kind of neoliberal model is fascinating, and I think you can call it a theory, right? Or it works because it works in the United Kingdom, it works in France, it works in Greece, it works in Germany, it works in the U.S. as well. And this clip here we have of Owen Jones. You have it up, Matt. Thank you.
Yep.
Is quite good because it's showing him. He's in Hartleby, right?
Hartlepool.
Hartlepool, excuse me. All those British words are a little confusing me sometimes. But here he is. He's speaking. Owen Jones is speaking with a Labour candidate who's trying to put forward Labour's plan for the region, right? Trying to say we have a particular demand and need for our area. And let's see what he has to say here.
Let me know if this sound doesn't work.
Don't use any platitudes when you answer this. What is Labour's vision for the country now? What does Labour stand for? Don't say fairness and everything being nice and mother had an apple pie. What is it concretely? What's the vision?
People in this election aren't talking though about Labour's vision for the country. They're talking about Labour's vision for Hartlepool.
Well, it's both. But okay, what's Labour's vision for Hartlepool? That's unique and different and distinct.
Yeah. So the best companies come to Hartlepool to provide the best jobs because we have the best trained people.
Do the Tories disagree with that?
Because we've invested in people right from the start of life, and you make that difference to children. So by the time they start school, they're not behind their peers. They can read. They can. You then have small class sizes and really good. My kids are at primary school, and they say that the class sizes are large. Their head teacher talks to me about cuts in schools and having to reduce teaching assistants. So you help the most vulnerable children. You help children with special educational needs. And when kids are, aren't coming to school, you send out support workers to find out what's going in the household, and you help people to get to a point where they can have really great skills, really great training, and then employers come to you not because you've got the lowest taxes, because you've got the best people. There's some direct things. That's
but you don't know politics. But do you?
The first thing that comes out of his mouth is the best businesses. And the entire reason for, I guess, educating and like making sure people aren't impoverished or in want is so that you can ultimately attract an employer. Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, I mean, where to even begin with that? I mean, there's two things that are happening in that clip, which, is pretty unforgettable. I mean, just as far as train wreck interviews go. I mean, I think probably in the most charitable reading, that guy, I've already forgotten his name. I think it might've been Williams. He was ultimately unsuccessful. Would you believe it that the people of Hartlepool were not, bowled over to get out and vote in droves for that agenda where kids can read. But a charitable interpretation is that's a guy, a local guy they found to run, and he's not comfortable with, talking like a politician. And Owen asked him a substantive question, right? And he panicked. But I think it's undeniable that the other thing that's certainly going on there is that he's unable to articulate a vision because the Labour Party in its current incarnation doesn't have one, right? There's no, if you were asked to define the Labour project under the leadership of Keir Starmer, I think the only things you could say substantively would be negative, right? They'd be about what the Starmer project is not, namely, the very popular agenda, popular with Labour members and with the British public, that was championed by the previous leadership, right? The big fight that I guess happened after this at the Labour conference sometime last year involved Starmer trying to change the rules in future Labour leadership elections so that it would be harder for a future candidate like Jeremy Corbyn to get on the ballot. I mean, think about what an incredible statement that is about the current leadership of the Labour Party, that they were investing their political capital in changing the rules that were going to determine how their successor was going to be chosen, right? In terms of a positive political vision, they're just there just isn't one, or not one beyond the one we just heard that poor fellow rather awkwardly try to articulate. It's just this, there's just a very kind of generalized orientation towards, well, we're going to make things better. We're going to support education and business. We're going to, support community. Like, it's just the vaguest, broadest kind of rhetoric there is. And that's because the, Starmer leadership is not really trying to pursue a coherent agenda. It's despite running, I mean, Starmer only got elected leader because he basically promised that he was going to continue much of the previous leadership's agenda, but he hasn't done that. He's mostly spent his political capital on fighting the left in the Labour Party and on kind of signaling to British capital and the Tory, mostly Tory dominated press, that he's not really going to threaten them in any serious way at all. And, again, kind of similar to what we were saying about Texas. I mean, that might be a strategy that once in a generation, a guy like this, just a total, centrist dullard, maybe under the right circumstances, he gets lucky and he wins an election. Usually I think that's not going to be the case. And, no matter what, doing this is never a way to build long-term power. It's not a way to build constituencies of voters that last, or activists that last from one election, to the next. Labour under Jeremy Corbyn had, I mean, I don't even remember what the peak was, but I think it was over 500,000 members signed up. So at a time when, participation in political parties is really probably lower than it's been at any point since the Second World War, suddenly the Labour Party in the post Tony Blair era was the biggest mass party in Europe, and it's lost hundreds of thousands of members since Starmer took over. And I think that's been quite intentional. The goal here is not to, champion an agenda or a particular vision of society. It's to triangulate until circumstances allow you to kind of, sneak by. And then once you're in government, you just kind of manage things in a very technocratic way. And in doing so, lay the foundations for the political right to get even scarier and more dangerous.
Yeah, I like your point that is like the response to that guy is pity. Like, this is the sort of program has to run, right? A replacement level politician, like, you want to give them something a little bit more like an enemy, for instance, like that sort of stuff. And he's got, it's like cargo cult mentality, basically.
Totally. Well, I have, I know we're going a little long, but there's two quick things I wanted to get to before we let you go, because I'd be sad if we didn't at least visit. One of my favorite chapters in the book was your chapter, David Brooks's Capitalist Fatalism, right? Where you're responding to an essay of his called "I Was Once a Socialist, Then I Saw How It Worked." And in that piece, Brooks goes on to sort of flex his real lefty socialist credentials. Which, just as a side note, I'm curious, what y'all think about this. Always really funny when kind of older liberals will do this to me, where they'll be like, "Well, when I was your age, I was a socialist," and then you really try to. It's like, "Oh, well, that's sort of exciting. Maybe we have something to talk about a little bit." And then you start to actually try to figure out what they mean by that. And it's very, very ethereal, right? That Brooks's like socialism seems to be, frankly, almost made up.
Chiron.
But not particularly deep at all. But, the crux of his argument, I would just like to hear your response to this, Luke, is that, all these things that we think as socialists are all well and good. But there is we're naive, right? We don't understand how the world actually works, and the world works by a certain logic that we then have to, try to add maybe some of our convictions to, but just know that you're just going to be extremely disappointed. I mean, how would you respond to that kind of, canned argument that we get a lot from older liberals?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, and I think, when it really comes down to it, so much of what animates, liberalism today, which, as I said, is functionally small c conservative. David Brooks, again, he's a conservative, but I mean, practically speaking, he's a right-leaning liberal, right? So much of what animates that kind of politics today just is that if you strip away all the artifice, all the rhetoric, all of the arguments, all of the policy commitments or lack thereof, what you're left with is just this deep-seated belief that things can actually really get better and that there's no point in trying. Now, I don't know what Brooks's own personal trajectory towards that conclusion has been. I mean, for a lot of older liberals, people that might support the Democratic Party might even read a magazine like The Nation. The way they arrived at, supporting Hillary Clinton over Bernie in 2016 was actually just, seeing Mondale lose and seeing Dukakis lose, and maybe even seeing, Nixon quash McGovern in 72. With someone like Brooks, I'm not sure what to make of, how he got there, because his account of his own trajectory is so disingenuous. He gave a version of this as a speech in Toronto, actually, which I saw. He was debating Yanis Varoufakis, and he and Arthur Brooks got absolutely owned by Varoufakis and Katrina vanden Heuvel of The Nation. But Brooks mentions this specific clip where he says, well, I turned against the left when I was in this debate with Milton Friedman, and I just had no answers, to his questions. And I went back and found the clip, and, what you can find is that Brooks, who's, a bespectacled 23-year-old, is making these pretty limp sort of like 70s liberal arguments, but he does not seem to have any kind of, deeper, left convictions. And he's certainly not a socialist. I think he was already working at the Wall Street Journal, and like a year or two after that, he moved over to, I think, the National Review. So it's really hard to tell in what sense he was ever a socialist. He seems to be trying to limply argue for a kind of New Deal liberalism, and doesn't have a good response to it. But I guess, or it doesn't have a good response to Milton Friedman, I should say. But I guess what I would say about the wider issue here is that I just don't think it's. I don't think on a philosophical level, I don't accept the premise that it is that the world can't be made better. And I mean, if we're limiting ourselves to just the United States, that the United States can't get better. I mean, I remember in that debate, I can't remember if it was Varoufakis or vanden Heuvel made the point that, like, well, there are countries that, have capitalism, but they're far more egalitarian than the United States. So, would you support, institutions like some of those that exist in Scandinavia, being adopted in the United States? And he kind of waffled on that. He just said, well, they have those for cultural reasons, and culturally, I don't think those could work in the United States. But those institutions and many others, including some which still exist in the United States, are clear evidence of, the power of, political change, different kinds of political institutions, their effectiveness in making society more just and more equal, right? I mean, before the 20th century, the welfare state didn't exist, right? No one had conceived of it. And during the 20th century, I think it's pretty incontrovertible that the welfare state improved, countless lives and gave, huge numbers of people an opportunity to flourish and, develop themselves and, have more free time and just have richer and fuller lives. And, there'd never been anything like that before in human history. So I just don't accept that argument.
Yeah.
I mean, for someone like Brooks, it might come out of almost a religious conviction. I mean, I think that is there's like conservative Christianity is a big animating force on the right, and so Brooks may just be borrowing from that some sense that, we're fallen creatures, and that's why we have to gut welfare programs and cut Social Security. But I don't accept that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know the limitations of that argument always sort of frustrate me a lot. But I want to ask you just briefly, just because, you've written this book. We've lived through some pretty wild times, financial crisis, COVID crisis. We saw this exciting kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, left populism movement in the United States with Bernie, the United Kingdom with Corbyn. You've seen Syriza. You've seen all these different formations, that have sort of risen up, and, they've done a lot, but they didn't necessarily take state power, except in the case of Greece. We've talked about how liberalism, hasn't delivered and hasn't been successful in the metrics that it puts out. But at the same time, it feels like that movement, again, even though it might not be, delivering, still feels very, very, cemented, or at least in the sense that, like, it's here to stay, right? Despite all these things that we thought they might have to change their playbook a little bit because of the shifting material realities, they haven't. I mean, Joe Biden, I think, is the perfect example of this. The world's ending, Donald Trump was president, and then what ends up happening in response to that, like one of the most old school kind of neoliberal politicians comes back in the presidency. I mean, do you think that liberalism, and more specifically like neoliberalism, is here to stay? And what is the kind of trajectory, over the next few years of this? Because it just doesn't seem like, at least from my perspective, that it's going to tire itself out until something shifts it. But I'm curious what you think.
It's hard. I mean, it's very hard to predict the future. I mean, I would say though on the question of liberalism, it's it being tired out. I mean, I think it already is tired out. I think Joe Biden is the best demonstration of that, right? As we were saying before, 2020, the Democrats tried to kind of reignite liberalism, smash the reset button with all these candidates who they thought people were going to find really exciting, and people were going to take to the streets to elect Michael Bennet, or whatever it was, or John Delaney, or Pete Buttigieg, or Beto, and that didn't happen, right? I mean, they defeated the Sanders insurgency, but they did so by smashing the emergency glass and kind of like pulling out this guy who was a vehicle for nostalgia as much as anything else. A guy who, because of his association with Obama, people were, connected people kind of psychologically to this like more exciting moment that people still remember fondly, or some people do. And, he was, he was just, kind of old guard Democratic machine politician. And I don't think that, I think that in some ways it would have been, if Democrats had been able to actually get people excited about someone like Pete Buttigieg, say, instead of Biden, and they defeated Bernie in 2020, I think we'd have more to worry about. I mean, I'm not saying that, the next Bernie is definitely going to win or anything like that, or that, the ramparts of neoliberalism, we're suddenly going to overwhelm them or anything like that, in the next few years. But I don't think there's a lot of dynamism here. I think they really are running on empty. The Biden presidency was able to sustain people's excitement for no more than a few months, really, through these announcements and, through one large bill that I guess they passed in February of 2021, the rescue plan. And, I don't think the outlook in the midterms looks particularly good. I don't think, the Democratic leadership just, I mean, more specifically, like, I mean, it's so old and crumbly. I think I say in the book somewhere that it kind of reminds you of like Brezhnev era USSR, right? It reminds you of that stretch, the kind of like twilight of the USSR, where, before Gorbachev, there was like that 2-year stretch where there were like 5 guys that all became, premier or president or whatever the title was, and they all died within a few months, or I don't remember, it was 5, but it was quite a few, right? They were just like cycling through all these old machine politicians, and no one could get the spluttering machine to working again, and in the end, it fell to Gorbachev to kind of work out a negotiated exit from that model, and I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here, but I certainly don't think that the outlook, at least in kind of the short and medium term, for either liberalism as a political force or as a consensus, I don't think either is particularly good. And of course, part of that is also not just because they're being challenged from the left, but because they're being challenged from the right, which of course is something we have to worry about as well.
Totally.
Well, people should pre-order the book. We'll have a link below. I want to just say, like, I want to ask you one more thing. Luke
Sure.
is sort of, if people aren't familiar, is sort of like the rapid response for Jacobin, the sort of staff writing, like constantly, responding to new political events, as they happen. It's very valuable, I think, work. I'm curious what your experience is like, packaging up your work like this into like a coherent thesis. It reminds me, and I don't make this comparison lightly, but we've already mentioned the Tribune. George Orwell has a collection of essays called "As I Please," and this was like during his World War II. He was writing this in London, and it's, people say 1984 or even like homage to Catalonia. That's, I think, very interesting Orwell. But it's interesting to read it after the fact. So I think like this is, like I said, like something people should pre-order and share with folks who aren't maybe as plugged into the Jacobin scene. But I'm just curious what your experience packaging this stuff up is like.
All right. Well, first off, thanks for the Orwell comparison. I hope reviewers see it that way as well. Let's get that from the New York Times review of books, and we'll be good to go. But yeah, Savage's prose, mix the best of Orwell with the best of James Baldwin, something like that. But yeah, I mean, I mean, I'm glad you asked that, and it's interesting to think about. I mean, I should say that the book, I think, turned out better than I expected, and it didn't really come together like I expected, or like I had expected originally, because originally the idea was just, I'm going to take what I think are my best essays and put them in a book, right? And when I sat down to actually kind of curate them, I realized that if I organized them a certain way, they actually did tell a story. They told a bigger story, even though, some of them are just, as you said, these kind of pretty rapid responsey things that I wrote in, during the Democratic primaries, or, just in response to kind of events as they were unfolding. And yeah, in the end, I mean, I like to think the book does tell a coherent story about the moment we're living in, even though a lot of the subject matter, by the time it comes out this summer, is going to, topically speaking, is going to be a little, behind us. But I think in spite of that, it does, kind of tell a bigger story. And yeah, I suppose what I hadn't realized when I was, writing a lot of the pieces that originally appeared in Jacobin is that even if I was just reacting to something, as it was happening, in a somewhat narrow way, that was kind of the field work, right? Those were the initial observations that I think have informed, like the larger arguments about the moment we're living in, and the politics of our moment. So yeah, it's interesting to think about. I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah, it leads to, I think, a richness of detail that when you're trying to write about a period after the fact entirely, you miss out a lot of that stuff. So I think like it's a really good synthesis of that. So the Dead Center: Reflections on Liberalism and Democracy After the End of History. Luke Savage, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, guys. This is great.